Good afternoon. I'm Rick Traynor, Principal of King's College London, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this event to which we have been keenly looking forward. We have the privilege this afternoon of welcoming one of Europe's most senior and respected statesmen, Monsieur Alain Juppé. Tonight, he's going to set out his vision for the future of Europe. And we're very fortunate to be able to hear his vision, as the career of Monsieur Juppé is extremely distinguished. He's been Mayor of Bordeaux since 1995, in addition to which he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs between 1993 and 1995, and again between 2011 and 2012. As Minister of Defense in 2010, and most prominently as Prime Minister of France under President Chirac from 1995 to 1997. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the other person on the platform at the moment, Professor Dominique Moisy, who's a visiting research professor here at King's, as well as a founder and senior advisor at the prestigious French Institute for International Relations. He's helped to facilitate tonight's event and will provide some brief reflections at the end. Now, King's is very pleased to be hosting this event, but I have to acknowledge to you that its origins were not particularly Francophile. As many of you know, King's was founded in 1829, and its two founders did not make their reputations as friends of France, I think it's fair to say. King George IV came of age in the 1790s, which was not an ideal period for friendship between France and Great Britain. Even more notably, the first Duke of Wellington, who was Prime Minister at the time, of course made his reputation by armed conflict against France. But I'm happy to say that despite that unpromising start in terms of relations between King's and Monsieur Juppé's country, that there's now a strong relationship between King's and France. I'm very happy to report that we have hundreds of French students at King's, and just under 2,500 graduates of King's living in France, about a third of whom live in Paris. And this relationship through our students, and of course many notable academics as well, has grown rapidly in recent years. Almost half of our French alumni have graduated from King's during the last 10 years. With that in mind, I'm particularly delighted that our King's Policy Institute has organized this extremely interesting event with such a high profile and prestigious speaker as part of that institute's Europe in Crisis project. We established the King's Policy Institute in 2012 with the aim of exchanging ideas and creating links between the community of academics at King's and the broader world of policymaking, both in the UK and globally. Events like the one this evening enable us precisely to build such a bridge. Tonight's discussion is particularly momentous as we're holding it, of course, on the eve of the European parliamentary elections. And I'm sure that tonight's lecture will provide much food for thought about the implications of those elections. I might say that we have a bit of a tradition here of welcoming French politicians whose careers are still rising. We welcomed Monsieur Hollande in February 2012, and we have Monsieur Juppé here this evening. So we will look forward, Monsieur Juppé, not only to the results of these elections, but to elections that have yet to unfold in your country. Our speaker will address us for about 20 to 25 minutes. We're then going to have an opportunity for about a quarter of an hour of questions from the floor from Monsieur Juppé. As is our habit here at King's, we've deliberately structured this event to have as much discussion as possible. So I'd encourage your active participation, but I would urge those of you who do speak actually to pose a question and to be as brief as possible. That way we'll get as many issues onto the agenda as we possibly can. Sadly, Monsieur Juppé's time in London today is strictly limited. He's got to leave us in order to catch the last Eurostar back to Paris, hence our need to be brief and concise on the questions. But although he won't be able to stay for the drinks reception afterwards, everyone here will be invited to that event in the Somerset Room, which is immediately above us. And being the Francophiles that we at King's now are, we shall, of course, be serving French wine. I'd now like, without further ado, to invite Monsieur Juppé to address us on the future of Europe. Please join me in welcoming him.
Professor Sir Rick Traynor, Principal and President of King's College, Professor Jonathan Grant, Director of King's Policy Institute, Monsieur le Chargé d'Affaires de l'Ambassade de France, ladies and gentlemen, dear students. It's a pleasure to be here again in London, and I would like to warmly thank King's College Professor Sir Rick Traynor, Professor Anand Menon, Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs, and my friend Professor Dominique Moisy, for inviting me as part of King's Policy Institute's Europe's in Crisis project. Thank you, Sir Rick Traynor, for remembering me some different periods of our common history, before and after the Entente Cordiale. Thank you also for serving French wine just after this conference. May I wish that there is some room for Bordeaux wine, which is the best French wine, as you know. When Dominique Moisy invited me to speak at King's College, I didn't imagine it would take place in such a passionate period, a few days before the European election, and here in Britain, the eve of the European election. In that context, it is difficult to speak well of the European Union. And when you do so, it sounds unconvincing. Everywhere, there is nothing but Euro-skepticism or even Euro-hostility. Every morning in France, I guess it is the same thing in Britain, the media and politicians heap all the sins of the world at the European Union's door. If we are to believe them, Europe is undemocratic, technocratic, often naive, powerless and divided, starved by austerity, the source of unemployment, and so on and so forth. Brussels, and I hope our friends, the Belgians, will forgive me here, has become the great bugbear. Is Europe actually responsible for all our ills? Let's examine current criticism. Although they are multiple and sometimes contradictory, they nevertheless have a point in common, the sense that national sovereignty has been lost. First of all, obviously, in the economic field. Brussels, the supranational power, which has confiscated from state the control of the economies, is said to prohibit them from acting in a sovereign manner in order to regain the path for growth. Brussels is said not only to have tied the hands of governments, but to have forced upon them, against their will, a remedy based on fiscal austerity, with a drastic reduction in public expenditure, and as a consequence, a rise in unemployment. This idea finds its most visible expression in the current attacks on the single currency. Here in Great Britain, you have chosen not to enter the euro. So this debate is undoubtedly not one of your main concerns. In France, it's different, and the euro today is the target of a systematic campaign, too strong. It is said to restrict our export and our competitiveness. As for the European Central Bank, it is seen as autistic and refusing all dialogue with the economic government of the Eurozone, assuming this government even exists. Another target I would like to mention is the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, TTIP, currently under negotiation. A recent French magazine cover ran the headline, I quote, "How the Americans are going to eat us alive." The theory is simple. The Commission in Brussels, an incorrigible supporter of ultraliberalism, will sell out our interests, particularly in the cultural field. Let's move on to the second major accusation aimed at Europe, its immigration policy or lack of policy. Brussels, by opening borders, is said to have removed all sovereignty from the member states over their own territory. Here again, we can admit that there is a measure of truth. Schengen, this agreement which is supposed to regulate population movement, does not work in a good way, mainly because Europe is not capable of controlling its external borders. The democratic deficit is doubtless the oldest accusation aimed at the European Union. Although it is undeniable that the Parliament has acquired real powers of co-decision, Europeans are still losing interest in their MPs. The polls of the next few days may unfortunately confirm this development. It is true that Brussels bureaucracy is too cumbersome, remote, and complicated, and that it produces too many standards in too many fields. The excess of standards genuinely damaging to the European cause. After years of debate on subsidiarity, this principle, you know, we have not made much progress in terms of what belongs to Europe and what should remain at national or even local level. Finally, out of all the accusations aimed at the EU, the subject of external relations should be mentioned. Rather than the loss of sovereignty, it is here a question of paralysis. The European Union's voice still not carrying on the international stage. On our eastern flank, the European Union was not able to prevent the annexation of Crimea by Putin or the destabilization of Ukraine. Across the Mediterranean, in the Sahel and in Africa, the EU procrastinated for months before deciding to intervene in an area where our interests are nonetheless directly at stake. In theaters like the Middle East, Europe continues to act only as a funder without any significant influence. Faced with the commercial and diplomatic challenges posed by China and the emerging countries, Europeans still do not manage to react in a collective fashion. National interests, in particular those of the major states like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, are too often divergent, and the Union has neither the means nor the capacity to impose a common position. Faced with all these criticisms, some of which are understandable, let us try to re-establish the truth. No, Europe is not responsible for our ills. I am deeply convinced of that. And I try to demonstrate my point of view. The upheaval which almost wiped out not only the financial markets, but also the world economy in 2008, 2009, was not Europe's doing. The practice of subprime lending and the deregulation of the markets originated not in Brussels, but in the US. And the European sovereign debt crisis cannot be blamed on Brussels. The blame should be laid at the door of Dublin, Athens, Rome, Madrid, or Paris, whose governments did not meet their commitments to reduce public deficits and manage debt. Let's go further. Not only is Europe not responsible for all our ills, but it has protected us. Solidarity, for example, the European Stability Mechanism for the benefit of states in economic difficulty, that is the European Union. And it is a great opportunity to have a stable currency. It was not so long ago, in the 90s, that the French franc was subject to a devastating attack on the markets. Can we imagine what Greece or Spain would have become if, in addition to the recession which hit them, the peseta or the drachma had collapsed? The debate on the exchange rate of the euro is used once more as a scapegoat for our own inadequacies. The stable euro involved historically low interest rates, without which the refinancing of our debt would lead us straight into disaster. A weak or devalued euro is not synonymous with competitive exports. Look at Japan today, which practices Abenomics, namely a policy based on a weak yen. And Japan, nevertheless, has recorded the worst trade deficit in its history during the last quarter. Although France also suffers from a heavy trade deficit, the reason is not mainly the euro exchange rate, but the deterioration in its competitiveness and the failure of its production sector to adapt to world demand, weaknesses which result from our own incapacity to implement the necessary reforms. After this rather gloomy assessment of the state of the Union, what can be done? Should we, are we constantly hearing, turn away from or even leave the European Union? And you know the success of the parties in France, like in Great Britain here, which defends this position. My conviction is simple. In this new world which has emerged, Europe remains an extraordinary opportunity, the best guarantee that we have, provided that it wakes up from its torpor, regains a common aim, reforms and dares to assert its model and its power. It is therefore high time that we got together again to work towards a common aim around some major projects for the future. We must regain our original faith and ancient Europe once again. This effort will be achieved by moving forward once again within the European Union. In our multi-centric world, in this international game where blocs are in increasingly fierce competition, we Europeans will only be able to influence matters if we are united. The EU is 500 million citizens, the largest GDP in the world, and 1/4 of world trade. Faced with globalization, instead of turning in on ourselves, instead of being traumatized by the transferal of wealth and power to other horizons, instead of despairing because we are no longer the center of the world, we do better to turn resolutely towards our Europe partners, to firmly embrace this community of destinies, which is called the European Union, and to occupy together our full place in the new world in order to spread our ideas and values, defend our interests, and share our views. The best way of defending Europe is to reform Europe, not change everything, as I sometimes hear in France. It is not a question of turning everything on its head, nor of going backwards, but, what is more difficult, of continuing to move forward. We have to restore a taste for Europe, remobilize European citizens around several ambitious objectives which affect them, and speak basis. First of all, we need a great common economic and industrial ambition. 50 years ago, the Airbus adventure united the French, Germans, British, Spanish, and some others, and today, the constructor has unseated Boeing to become #1 in the world. What will be the Airbus of the 21st century? In Europe, we have the best researchers, engineers, and mathematicians. If we really want to, if we place our big businesses together at the heart of our future, we can become the equals of, or even overtake our Indian, Korean, Chinese, or Brazilian competitors. To do so, we have to target the sectors of the future: the knowledge society, information technologies, innovation. We must also rise above antagonism between states. Today, the political will is not there, and European companies are at loggerheads with each other. A policy for the creation of European champions is, however, necessary. In order to do this, it will be necessary to reform European competition law and authorize the emergence of dominant champions capable of measuring up to their major non-European competitors. And I appreciate very much Mrs. Merkel's recent call for a new approach allowing to set up European champions. It will be a kind of revolution compared to the dominant idea of competition in the original treaty founding the European community. The second major project we could have altogether is energy. Adopting a common and sustainable energy policy for our continent, that is one of the major challenges for the coming years. This is still a long way from happening. Internally, the member states disagree on the approach to adopt in France and Germany, in particular on nuclear energy. Externally, we depend on Russia, which wills and will continue to wield the energy weapon. It is time to set once and for all the course for a common policy focused as a matter of priority on securing our supply. The EU consumes around 20% of the energy produced in the world. It has only 1% of worldwide oil reserves and 1.5% of gas. Until now, it has concentrated on two priorities: market liberalization and reduction in consumption for ecologic issues. In doing so, and encouraged by several decades of abundant energy, the EU has neglected the basis of its policy, a reliable supply. The states continue to be independent in their choice of sources and their energy mix. But out of the 28 countries in the EU, 6 are 100% dependent on Russia gas, and 12 are more than 50% dependent. I would suggest a few possible routes. Rely on renewables and nuclear, the only sources likely to meet the requirements of our climate policy. We must not go backwards and turn to the development of fossil fuel sources, whether new or traditional. Second, actively pursue the policy of infrastructure development throughout the continent. And third, instead of acting in a disparate manner, adopt a common policy with regard to external partners, Russia, of course, but also the Arab countries and the United States on shale gas. Third major area, also neglected for years, a Europe of young people based on multilingualism. Despite the diversity written into its motto and a linguistic administrative system based on the respect for all its languages, the EU has never implemented a real policy of multilingualism. The most we can point to, after several communications from the European Commission, is the creation in 2009 of a civil society platform on multilingualism. 83% of Europeans state that they have mastered languages other than their own, but 44% only, 44%, excuse me, are incapable of holding a conversation in a foreign language. On the other hand, 3/4 support the aim that everyone should learn at least 2 foreign languages, according to a recent Eurobarometer. We need to go beyond the stage of recommendation by the Commission. The Member States must take ownership of the subject and head towards a common policy which begins with the basics, namely school. Apart from the beneficial effects of multilingualism in economic terms, it should be obvious to everyone, European children of the 21st century must be multilingual. All little Europeans should know at least 2 languages, including 1 European, in addition of their mother language. Finally, I will appeal for a proper security and defense policy. The Europe of the 21st century will only exist on this condition. Europe can no longer be satisfied with being a single market. There is no world power which does not protect its prosperity or defend its interests. If Europe, a major economic power, wants to be a political player respected on the international stage, it owes it to itself to have a credible defense policy. To this should of course be added the budgetary necessity which affects us all. It would be unreasonable not to pool our resources as the era of the American shield in Europe is behind us. Our European security and defense policy, in spite of those remarks, is hopelessly stalled. This is first of all a failure of collective political will. Faced with the events which are catching up with us, the recent crisis in Africa demonstrated amply. The efforts of France on this point are either isolated or barely supported by its partners. 2 European operations, the training of Malian armed forces in 2013 and the EUFOR military operation in the Central African Republic on last April, relied on France's efforts. With the exception of a training mission for Somalian troops in 2010, the EU did not launch any new operation, civil or military, between 2008 and 2012. At institutional level, work is not progressing. Since 2011, when Poland made European defense one of its priorities and wanted to revive the Weimar Triangle that meets France, Germany, and Poland, the CSDP, the Common Security and Defense Policy, has not made any significant progress. The latest conclusions of the European Council in December 2013 only reiterated the same injunction of a general nature: increase the effectiveness of the CSDP. Well, but what does it mean? Improve rapid reaction capacity, strengthen capacity. No mention of an integrated headquarters, European OHQ, the Center for Planning and Operation Management. No progress on the employment of European battle groups, however unused, including the Franco-German Brigade. Referral to roadmaps, and to 2015 to report to the Council on the change which have occurred at international level. The EU and its member states, say the European Council, I quote, may exercise at international level an unparalleled capacity to combine policies and instruments ranging from diplomacy, security, and defense to finance, trade, development, and justice. Why don't we do so? A qualitative leap is necessary. Entrust European defense to the few states which have the will and the capacity, France and Great Britain first of all, if the latter agrees to change position on the OHQ. And I wasn't successful on this point when I tried to convince my friend William Hague at the end of 2011 to accept such a new measure. Germany, Poland, and some others like Italy and Spain. Despite the entry in force of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, a number of institutional possibilities, notably permanent structure and cooperation have not been implemented. If there is one field in which an à la carte Europe is legitimate, taking into account the diversity of means and tradition of its members, it is surely that of defense, equipment, technology, training centers. Europeans already have all the ingredients for European defense to serve all. The only thing missing is the political will. Beyond these necessary political efforts, let us attempt in conclusion to imagine what a new Europe could be, a Europe of the 21st century. How could this Europe of the future be organized? We must begin with the current priority, the creation of a European economic government. The urgent matter is to provide the heart of the EU, namely the Eurozone, with collective governance, a common economic policy, and in particular, as we have seen, a common monetary policy cannot exist without a common government. Progress has recently been accomplished in this area, often on the initiative of France. Moreover, worldwide upheavals have had the paradoxal virtue of obliging us to progress further towards integration, firstly, by introducing banking supervision at European level. We must go further and harmonize our economic policies, budgetary, of course, but also and especially fiscal between member states. We must seize one day to make consensus the rule in fiscal matters. To govern together and escape from our current imbalances, we must therefore head, I said clearly, towards further integration in economic matters. To summarize my message with a slogan, we have come too far not to go further. How should we proceed? Firstly, begin with the Franco-German couple, not Franco-French, it's quite difficult, I agree with that. But Franco-German couple at the heart of this Eurozone and strengthen it. This couple cannot work only if our two countries, France and Germany, act as equals. And that is the key. Germany today is hesitating. France today doesn't have the capacity to convince it because it has lost a large part of its credibility. Our countries have been on an increasingly divergent trajectory for too long. 160 billion euros, trade surplus for Germany, 77 billion euros deficit for France. 25% of young people unemployed in France, 8% in Germany. France is not a desperate case. It has all the assets necessary to become a credible partner once more. Ample savings, top-class infrastructures, favorable demographics, and also the willingness of our young people to be entrepreneurs and innovate. And I would like to underline this point. I read recently that between 2007 and 2011, the increase in the number of business created was larger in Europe than in the other developed countries. And among European countries, France, with an increase of 4.5% per year of net business startups, is doing better, for once, than Germany and the United Kingdom. France is remarkable for a very high level of entrepreneurial intent, the highest of developed countries. In 2012, 17% of French people between 18 and 64 years old declared that they wanted to start a business in the following 3 years. This is a complete about turn, as in 2002, France came last in this classification. We will, of course, seek the good and, above all, the bad reasons for this development. But what conclusion is evident? Contrary to the generally accepted idea, the French regard entrepreneurs in a positive light. They have an enterprising spirit, a love for work, and a taste for risk-taking. It's an opportunity for our country, provided that we are able to return or bring back our creative people, for example, if they have based themselves in London. It wouldn't take much a credible tax reduction program funded by a regular drop in public expenditure, a program for the relaxation of standards and regulation which stifle production, and above all, collective consideration for our entrepreneurs who know that businesses only progress if employees are also considered. It is more likely that not all the member states will want to take the plunge into this integrated inner circle of the Eurozone. Can we not then imagine around this Europe a broader zone, a different, wider Europe? Here I am obviously posing the question to Great Britain. Indeed, British citizens are legitimately entitled to say what they wish to do. An à la carte Europe, which people sometimes pretend to take offense at, in reality already exists. The Eurozone, Schengen, the British check, the opt-outs of some member states, all this outlines a system with an increasingly viable format. To conclude, I'll add that this future dream, probably considered as utopian by many, is possible because Europe exists. You just have to travel the vast world, in Asia, in Africa, in America, to become aware of a reality which we perceive poorly close up. Europe exists. We, the Europeans, have a common asset. We share a common culture, values, and ideas about the world. I do not underestimate our differences, far from it. Nor do I wish to eliminate them, they enrich us. And after 50 years of European building, we are still British, still French, still German, and I hope it will continue. But there is a common core. Democracy, freedom, human dignity, equality between men and women. Where do these values flourish better than in Europe? Philosophy, literature, music, and the arts, isn't there a European brand? It would be pretentious on my part to wish to define it, and others, more knowledgeable or more profound, have done so and will do so. Indeed, there is not yet a constituent European people, the direct source of sovereignty at European level. But there is a collective European feeling, the feeling of a certain identity shared by the people who occupy this space, as the French historian Jacques said, a European sense of community which was formed in the Middle Age. Let's not turn our backs on history, on Europe, and the construction of Europe. If we undermine the edifice, anything becomes possible, including the worst. Let's not forget the abomination which took place in our continent during the last century. The construction of Europe brings up the supreme good, peace, and the prosperity which accompanies it after a century of massacres. Are we really aware that this blessing cannot be taken for granted? War struck the Balkans on our doorstep 20 years ago. Our eastern neighbors, I'm thinking of Ukraine, of course, are going through a very serious crisis. On the borders of the Union itself, the old demons are not dead. Some small groups are parading, still today, reviving nationalist ideas and slogans. Faced with this worst of temptation, I know that Europe and Europeans are capable of looking to the future. They have the will to regain and rebuild a humanism for the 21st century, lucid and challenging. This humanism of which we are proud and which must forever remain the mark of our continent. My thanks to you all.
As predicted, we've reached the point after that elegant and highly substantive address by Monsieur Juppé, where you in the audience get your chance to pose some questions. And what I'm going to try to do is to take 2 or 3 at a time and then allow Mr. Juppé to group together some answers. And it would be useful, as I said at the outset, if you were brief and get right to the point of your question so that Mr. Juppé can have a chance to answer more than a few of the points to be made. And it'd be useful also if you could tell us who you are and if perhaps you have some connection to this institution or some other you'd like to advertise, let us know which it is. We'll start in the back up there.
Hello, I'm Vladimir Darcourt and I study European Studies here at King's. Thank you very much for coming first. My question is about the democratic deficit, because you've talked about many things, but I think the main problem with young people is that they don't feel represented by the European Union. And you've really not talked about that, and we had the whole discourse about what we can do, what we can change. But the main thing, if we want Europe to work, is to have citizens involved, because Europe is based on democracy and peace as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I've got a question down here in the front on the left.
Nick Butler, King's College. Thank you again for coming. It's much appreciated, and you're very welcome. Can I ask what could be seen as a parochial question? We are due in this country to vote on whether we should continue to be members of the European Union by the end of 2017. That's the government's commitment. Do you believe that the UK's continued membership is important to the Europe of the future that you're talking about? And if so, do you think that France and the other member states should now permit a treaty change that would allow the UK to move perhaps in a rather different way to the greater integration that you're talking about?
Thank you. And I've got in the 4th row, now right here, a woman about six in. There she is. Here she is. There we go. Pass it along.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Juppé, for coming. I have a question regarding the link between European politics and French politics at the moment, because I understand that you want more Europe, you want more integration, but I have the feeling from reading French news as a French citizen that your position is quite not as popular right now in the UMP party, and the fact that you have asked Monsieur Henri Guénaud to leave the UMP last week because he disagreed with you on European matters. I was just wondering if European politics will become another cleavage within the French right, and whether the French right can now have the luxury to be once more divided on the European question, with 2017 in mind. Thank you.
I think we should let those 3 questions, they coalesce in a funny sort of way, so Monsieur Juppé can now respond.
I hope I can escape domestic questions on the French political life here at King's College, but you started, Professor, by evoking 2017. But I will answer the question, of course. Monsieur Guénaud is not really representative of the majority of the UMP. He has his own view of the future of Europe, and I respect it. I never demand the exclusion of Monsieur Guénaud. I said, if he appeals to vote not for the candidate of the UMP in Paris, but for another candidate, it is a problem, and it should draw the consequences of this attitude. On the line of the majority of the UMP, things are as clear as they can do, because the Gaullist party and the right have always been divided on Europe. I don't know about divided. There are different sensibilities. And even during, when I was the Secrétaire Général of the RPR, it was the case. Monsieur Chaban-Delmas and Monsieur Debré, pardon, I'm talking about dinosaurs of the last century, were not on the same line. Today our line is very clear. First, we are in favor of the continuing the building of Europe. and we are fighting against those who want to demolish Europe. That's clear. And it's a clear message towards the extreme left and the extreme right. Second point, we think if we want to relaunch Europe, to reform Europe, France must change and must recover its role, its rank in Europe, and we have to implement domestic reforms to do so. And third, Europe is not perfect, and so we have to reform Europe around this idea I developed before, an inner circle integrated, the Eurozone, and around that, a wider circle, more flexible, with different possibilities for member states. This is the common view of the UMP. Second question was the question of the membership of UK, and I want to be clear on this point. I think that France, I cannot speak on behalf of France, I develop my point of view, and I think it's largely shared by many French people. We are very attached to the membership of the United Kingdom in the European Union. We want Great Britain to remain member of the EU. I think it would be a catastrophe to see the UK leaving what we have done all together during the last decades. Are we ready to accept treaty changes to reach this target? I don't like this idea of treaty changes, because to change treaties we must have the consensus of 28 countries. It's very difficult. I think that the existing treaties, with the possibilities like structured cooperation, reinforced cooperation, offer different possibilities to have an Europe à la carte, as I have said before, without changing really the treaties, but we are ready to adaptation in order to facilitate the presence of the UK inside our family. Democratic deficit, it's one of the major accusations aimed at the EU, and there is a large share of truth in this attack, of course, but things have changed. What is democracy? Democracy is election. Democracy is parliament. Democracy is choosing the representative of the people in Strasbourg and Brussels. And we have the opportunity to demonstrate your attachment to democracy. Vote tomorrow. Vote tomorrow. You can see at the same time there is no democracy in Europe, and to abstain when you have the possibility to choose your MPs. And those MPs, those members of European parliaments, are not today just some, how to say, potiche. They have power. The European Parliament has strong power according to the last Treaty of Lisbon. It has a power of co-decision on every issues in Europe, except some few issues. The Parliament has a power of co-decision with the Council and the Council of Ministers and the European Council. So do not neglect this Parliament is effective. And for example, he played a role, a very important role, by supporting the progress towards equality between men and women. It's an initiative of the Parliament. Recently, when the United States wanted to obtain some information about some data in Europe, the Parliament protected the private life of European citizens. So the Parliament is important. There is a second way to develop the democratic efficiency of Europe. It is the role of national parliament. And in the Treaty of Lisbon, the role of national parliaments has been increased. And so in your parliament, here in Britain, as in France, there are possibilities to question the Commission and to have some information about what Brussels is doing. I just want to take an example. The negotiation of the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It is said that this negotiation is completely not transparent. That's not true. If you ask the question to European member of the European Parliament, there is a reporting of the commissioner in charge of the negotiation, a regular reporting to the member of the parliaments. So transparency is not maybe perfect, but it exists. Unfortunately, it is not said on the medias, and this is a problem. all the information given in Europe are, by the time being, negative information. And I take the case of the example of the TTIP. I was struck by that when I was listening to French media. The specialist of this media was an economist, developed all the dangers of this treaty. French will eat chicken with eau de javel, beef with hormone, and our cultural industry will be destroyed by this agreement between the States and the Europe. Not a word about the advantages of this free trade, possible cooperation between the United States and Europe, and the incidents, for example, or the consequences on growth, on employment, on job creation. So we have a very difficult job today, is to communicate in a good spirit on Europe issues. It's difficult, and maybe it's also your role to spread the good messages. And I'm trying, but it's very difficult today.
Okay, let's have a few more questions. One right up there at the end.
Monsieur le Ministre, thank you for your lucid discours. You accused Russia of destabilizing Ukraine, but isn't it closer to the truth that it was the United States that destabilized Ukraine? After all, we have YouTube evidence of the Assistant Secretary for State talking to her ambassador in Kiev in February and instructing him to encourage a Ukrainian movement to overthrow a democratically elected government. And related to that, why has France, which used to be so good to speaking truth to American power, become such a poodle, such a British poodle, such a sycophantic supporter of American policies, however ill-informed and misconceived they might be?
I think we get your drift on that one. Right, we have one right here in the middle.
Small accession, recent new people to thank you very much, to the European club, Romania and Bulgaria. I just want to say a little bit about enlargement. Do you think it's still desirable in your vision of a new Europe, or a more improved Europe, as you say? Second, could you say a little bit about, and my German is very bad here, Foreign Office, Spitzenkandidat as a method of choosing leaders? What do you think of that? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Could you clarify the latter part of your question, please?
Well, just that Spitzenkandidat as a method of choosing leaders, as a method of people.
Choosing which method? I'm sorry, I'm not.
La candidat, ça s'appelle comment? Spitzen? J'ai oublié le terme. There is a technical expression.
We need a bit of gender balance here.
It's not English nor French.
Right.
It's German, I think.
There we go. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Juppé, and thank you very much for giving this talk. My question is about the relationship between Turkey and the European Union. You talked a lot about the collective and the collective values and culture and identity that we share between the European countries, and you also talked about this skepticism about this identity and also about the economic capacities of the European Union. Thus, I wondered what you think, and if you think that it's reasonable from Brussels to still negotiate on the adhesion of Turkey in the European Union on the economic side as much as on the cultural aspect.
Okay, we'll pause there.
Two questions deals with the same issue, if I well understood, enlargement. I think that the European Union today has no more, and for a long time, the capacity to enlarge itself. It was a good idea to welcome the former démocratie populaire. We commit ourselves to welcome them in the family after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I prefer to talk about reunification of Europe better than enlargement as far as those countries are concerned. But now I think we have to stop that, because Europe is fragile. There is many contests inside Europe. We don't see clearly the future of this very ambitious building, so you have to wait before enlarging more our community. And that's, of course, applies to Turkey. I love this country. I traveled inside Turkey when I was a young student, and it's a very attractive country. It's a great power today, but we have not the capacity in Europe to welcome a country of, I don't remember exactly, 60 million inhabitants? 80 millions maybe, or 60 millions, with all the difficulties you know. And I must add that the recent evolution of the regime in Turkey is not an incentive to be more open to the entry of Turkey. So maybe in the future, but not in the short or medium term. For the choice of the President of the Commission, I think we must respect the treaties. The Lisbon Treaty says that the European Council must propose to the European Parliament a candidate in taking into account the results of the election. En français, en tenant compte des résultats des élections. So it doesn't mean that the leader of the party, of the different parties of the European Parliament, PPE, European Popular Party, and the Socialist Party, will be the candidate. But the candidate must be chosen among those political family, according to the result of the election. And if it doesn't happen, I think there will be a very difficult conflict between the Parliament and the Council, because the candidate designed by the Council must be ratified by the Parliament, must be elected by the Parliament. So we'll have to find an agreement, a compromise between the Council and the Parliament. Ukraine, I don't share your vision of the situation in Ukraine. There is a long time that Ukraine tries to sign an association agreement with Europe. There is a large part of the population in Ukraine which is fascinated by the model of Europe. Europe is still attractive. For many people in Ukraine, Europe means democracy, a better level of way of life, and standard of life. And that's why there was a strong pressure in many sectors of the Ukrainian society to sign an agreement with Europe. Putin cannot accept that, because he wants that Ukraine remains in the sphere of influence of his new empire. His idea is to rebuild a kind of empire, maybe not the Soviet Union, but something like this. And so this is the origin of the conflict. Then after that, I don't know if the US ambassador exerts some pressure on Kiev, but what I state that is Putin launched an operation of annexation of Crimea, and it succeeded. And he trying to do so not to annex Ukraine globally, but to destabilize Ukraine in order to stop in a agreement between Ukraine and the EU, and to keep Ukraine in the sphere of influence of Putin. That is my interpretation of the situation, and I'm not blaming the US on this point. What to do facing such an issue? Nobody wants to have a military confrontation of Russia, of course. Don't be foolish. Well, it's the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Grande Guerre, of the First World War. And in some days, there will be ceremonies in France celebrating the debarkment of 1945. So let's forget this idea. But we must restore with the Russia of Putin's a balance of influence and power. And we have the means to do so, because Russia is not a so strong country. Russia is a fragile country with a demographic, catastrophic demography, with a need of foreign investment to modernize its economy, with the necessity also to sell its gas and its petrol. So it's possible to have a dialogue, but a strong dialogue with Russia to say stop, to do so, or we'll implement some economic sanction. I think it is a speech that Putin can understand. For the moment, we are not able to have a strong message and a common will to face this situation, because we are all shared between different consideration. On one side, we want to be strong with Putin, and on the other side, we want to sell to Putin our ships, our city, our industry, our industrial products, and so on. And so this is a very difficult problem of realpolitik to face the situation.
Thank you very much. I think we should turn now, because the Eurostar's schedule is looming ever larger, to Professor Moisey for his reflection.
And Eurostar is always on time.
That's right. That's because of the Entente Cordiale, don't you think, Monsieur Juppé?
Well, I have very little time, and I just want probably to summarize the main points made by Alain Juppé. I think the key sentence, which I liked a lot, which is, "We've come too far not to go further," which reminds me very much of a sentence used by Joschka Fischer a few days ago in Berlin. We can't go backward. We have to go forward. In other terms, there's no alternative to Europe, and for so many reasons. And one of them, you mentioned it, and it's to fix limits to Putin. Only a united European Union can do that. The second point, which I thought was very important, was the place of France in that process. We may be morose, the most pessimistic country on earth, if you take the collective look of the French at themselves, more pessimistic, it has been said by some opinion polls, than the Afghan. And of course, quite positive about their own life. My country going down the drain, but myself, I'm quite happy. Of course, the disconnect hides a deeper reality, which is that there might be something that don't go well in France, but when it comes to the spirit of entrepreneurship, it's much better. I wouldn't dare to say what I'm going to say than politics. The third point, which Alain Juppé said, and which I think is key, and in particular given the date, it's a message to Great Britain. And I'm going to use formulas he didn't use. 3 may be a crowd in a wedding, in a marriage, but 3 is necessary for Europe to continue to work. And I would say, and these are my words, that as much as Scotland cannot dream of separating ourselves from Great Britain, Great Britain cannot dream of separating ourselves from the European Union. These 2 moves towards not so splendid isolation are in fact condemned by the logic of the evolution of the world. And on this very brief summary, I would like to thank very much again Alain Juppé for having accepted the invitation of King's College, which is my new house in university terms. The guillotine of age has fallen upon my shoulders in France. It's much less painful than the guillotine itself. But still, second, I would add two things. The first one is that this event, which you have attended, will be followed up by a post on the Policy Institute's new blog. So the team will send you an email when that is posted, and please do read it and pass on to colleagues. Second, this event is part of a wider Europe in Crisis project, and bearing in mind tonight's talk, you know that there are important elections to be held tomorrow, and King's Europe in Crisis project will have a panel following Europeans parliamentary elections, and the panel will consist of Mads Pearson, Director of Open Europe, Professor Sarah Hobolt from the London School of Economics, and Philip Stephens, who is the Associate Editor of the Financial Times. So this reflection on Europe will continue, even with purely British participants. So it remains for me to thank you very much, Professor Sir Rick Traynor, for agreeing to chair the event, King's College in London for providing such a stimulating environment for the event, the Policy Institute at King's and its Professor Jonathan Grant and his team for having organized the event with such skill, and last but not least, Monsieur Juppé, for speaking so articulately, passionately, and with such insight and vision on the future of Europe. We need your voice very badly at the European level today. Thank you very much.